The tale of Jonas Brandt is not one of ghosts or rattling chains, but of a horror born of perception itself. It is a story etched in the obscure annals of medical impossibilities from 1879, a case where the organ of sight became a window not to the world we know, but to one layered over it, invisible and vast. It begins with a child's simple aversion to a summer day, and ends in a silence so profound that it consumed a family, leaving behind only the chilling question of what the boy's eyes truly saw in the light that he could no longer bear. If the quiet dread of history's unanswered questions is what you seek, and you are new to this archive, subscribe to ensure you do not miss the turning of another forgotten page. The year was 1879, and the sun that fell upon the Brandt family farm was an unforgiving thing, a brilliant hammer that beat the fields to gold and bleached the very wood of the house to a bone-like gray. It was a sun that dictated the rhythms of life, drawing Silas from his bed before its rise and sending him back to the house, weary and scorched, long after its descent. His wife, Ilara, knew its moods as well as she knew her husband's, tracking its progress across the sky by the shifting squares of light on the rough-hewn floorboards of their small home. For them, the sun was life. It was the heat that coaxed the corn from the soil, and the light that held the long, cold shadows of winter at bay. It was a divine constant, a source of power one did not question or defy. Yet their only child, Jonas, had begun to defy it. At 9 years of age, he was a boy made of shadows and whispers, his skin possessing a pale, almost translucent quality that seemed unnatural in a place where every other living thing was burnished by the daylight. Jonas was not a sickly child, not in any way a physician could define. He was small for his age, with hair the color of dried flax, and a quietness that often made his parents forget he was in the room. His one true pleasure was found in small blocks of pine wood and his father's carving knife. He would sit for hours in the dimmest corner of the main room, shavings curling around his feet, his small hands patiently working the wood into the forms of birds and foxes, creatures he had only ever seen in the twilight hours when the world softened to gray and indigo. His carvings were his only real voice, a silent testament to a world he observed from the safety of the shade. His parents saw this as a sign of a thoughtful, artistic temperament, a gentle spirit unsuited to the brutalities of farm life. They took a quiet pride in his stillness, seeing in him a refinement they themselves had never known. The boy's aversion to the outdoors was, at first, a simple quirk, a childish preference for the cool, dusty air of the barn over the searing heat of the open fields. It was Ilara who first felt the prickle of unease. She began to notice the way Jonas moved through the world, a constant, subtle negotiation with the light. He did not simply walk from one room to another. He plotted a course through the shadows, skirting the brilliant rectangles cast by the windows. If she opened a curtain to let in the morning air, he would flinch, his small hand flying up to shield his eyes as if from a sudden blow. He would complain that the light was too sharp, that it made his head ache. Silas, a practical man, dismissed it at first. He told her the boy had weak eyes, that he had perhaps spent too much time indoors with his carvings, and his sight had grown unaccustomed to the honest light of day. He suggested Jonas simply needed to be hardened, to be forced into the sun until he could withstand it like any other farm boy. But their attempts to do so were met with a reaction that was not stubbornness, but genuine distress. The boy would not cry or scream. He would simply stand, frozen, at the edge of the porch, his body trembling as he stared at the sun-drenched yard, his breathing shallow and quick. He would describe the pain not as a simple brightness, but as 1,000 tiny needles piercing his eyes, a feeling of being overwhelmed by something he could not name. The concern deepened from a subtle worry to a persistent, gnawing anxiety. Jonas began to wear one of his father's old, wide-brimmed hats, even indoors, pulling it down so low that his face was perpetually cast in shadow. He ate his meals with his back to the window, and if a stray beam of sunlight touched his skin, he would recoil with a soft gasp. The other children in the small, scattered community of farms began to notice his strangeness. They called him the Shadow Boy, a name that followed him in whispers whenever he was forced to accompany his parents to the general store or to Sunday service. His isolation grew, a wall built of his own inexplicable fear. Silas and Alara watched their son retreat further into his world of twilight and wood shavings, a silent, pale creature who seemed to haunt the edges of their sunlit life. The humanizing detail of his patient, skilled hands, once a source of pride, now seemed a symptom of his affliction, an activity that allowed him to remain cloistered in the gloom he so desperately craved. The breaking point came on a clear, cloudless afternoon in late August. Alara had asked Jonas to fetch a bucket of water from the well, a simple chore he had performed 100 times before. The well stood in the middle of the yard, unprotected from the full, punishing glare of the midday Sunday. Jonas hesitated at the door, his small frame silhouetted against the darkness of the house. He took a few tentative steps onto the porch, then stopped. His parents, watching from the kitchen window, saw his entire body tense. He raised his hands to his eyes, his fingers splayed as if to block every possible ray of light. He began to whimper, a low, desperate sound that spoke not of defiance, but of pure terror. He said the light was too full, that there were things moving within it, shimmering and jagged, that hurt to look at. Silas, his patience finally exhausted, strode onto the porch and took the boy by the arm, intending to lead him to the well and put an end to the nonsense. But the moment they stepped into the direct sunlight, Jonas collapsed. He did not faint, but crumpled to the ground, his body curling into a tight ball, his hands clamped over his eyes, screaming that it was too bright, that he could see too much. That evening, the decision was made. The boy's condition was not a weakness of character or a simple sensitivity. It was an ailment, something beyond their understanding and beyond their ability to mend. The following morning, Silas hitched the horse to the wagon, and the family made the long, dusty journey to the town where Dr. Alistair kept his practice. The town was a place of straight lines and solid, reassuring brick buildings, a world away from the untamed nature of their farm. The doctor's office was a sanctuary of order and reason, smelling faintly of carbolic acid and old paper. The walls were lined with books whose leather-bound spines promised knowledge and answers. Dr. Alistair himself was a man who embodied this world of logic. He was methodical and kind, with a calm, reassuring voice that had soothed the fears of countless patients. He listened patiently as Alara, her voice trembling, recounted the litany of her son's strange behaviors, the flinching, the headaches, the terror of the open yard. The examination began in a room where the light was controlled by heavy velvet curtains. Dr. Alistair was thorough, his movements precise and unhurried. He checked Jonas's hearing, his reflexes, his posture. He found nothing amiss. The boy was slight, but he was not frail. He was quiet, but he was coherent. Then came the examination of the eyes. The doctor used an ophthalmoscope, a modern marvel of brass and polished lenses, to peer into the boy's pupils. He leaned in close, his own breath held in concentration, and saw what he expected to see, a perfectly healthy eye. The retina was a flawless landscape of delicate veins. The optic nerve was clear and well-defined. He explained to Silas and Alara that there was no sign of disease, no inflammation, no physical defect that could possibly account for such a severe sensitivity to light. He told them the boy's vision, by all medical standards, was flawless. It was when he tested the pupil's reaction that the first hint of the unnatural surfaced. He lit a small candle and moved it slowly toward Jonas's face. As expected, the boy's pupils contracted, shrinking to tiny black pinpricks to protect the eye from the flame. But when the doctor moved the candle away, plunging that side of the boy's face back into shadow, the pupil remained constricted. It did not relax and widen to let in more of the ambient light. It stayed tight and small, a defensive posture held long after the threat had passed. Dr. Alistair frowned, a small crease appearing between his brows. He repeated the test, this time with an oil lamp, and then again, simply by drawing back the heavy curtain a few inches to let in a sliver of afternoon Sunday. Each time, the result was the same. The pupils would contract instantly, but they would refuse to dilate again for several long, unsettling minutes, even when Jonas was returned to near complete darkness. The doctor confessed he had never seen such a thing. He explained to the bewildered parents that a pupil's response was an involuntary reflex, a mechanical function of the eye. For it to behave in such a way was, he said, a physiological impossibility. It was as if the boy's eyes perceived a thread of light that was not there, as if they were reacting to a memory of brilliance, or perhaps, the doctor mused aloud, to a brilliance that only Jonas himself could see. He had no name for the condition. He could find no mention of it in the thick medical textbooks that lined his shelves. He could offer no medicine, no treatment, no explanation that belonged to the world of science. He suggested that perhaps the affliction was of the mind, a nervous condition, an overactive imagination that had somehow manifested as a physical symptom. He advised rest, calm, and a quiet environment, suggestions that sounded hollow and useless to Alara and Silas. They were already living in a world defined by their son's need for quiet and shadow. The ride home was a study in silence. The familiar landscape, the fields of corn and the distant line of trees, seemed alien and menacing. The setting sun, which should have been a comforting promise of respite, painted the sky in hues of orange and red that seemed to mock them with their intensity. They had gone to the town seeking an answer, a name for the thing that was wrong with their son, a cure that could be bottled and administered. They returned with only a deeper, more unsettling mystery. Science, with all its books and instruments, had looked at their son and found him to be perfectly whole, yet broken in a way it could not comprehend. Dr. Alistair's words echoed in Silas's mind. His eyes were reacting to a brilliance that only he could see. The thought was more terrifying than any diagnosis of disease. It suggested that the problem was not with Jonas's eyes, but with the world he was seeing through them. In the weeks that followed, the Brandt's world shrank to the four walls of their farmhouse. They surrendered to Jonas's condition, accepting that their life would now be lived according to the dictates of his strange affliction. The curtains remained drawn, the doors kept shut. The house was a permanent twilight, the air thick with the smell of dust and lamp oil. Jonas seemed to grow more comfortable in this curated gloom. He spent his days with his carving, his collection of small wooden animals growing into a silent, still life forest on the floor of his room. He spoke little, but the constant, hunted tension seemed to have eased from his small body. His parents watched him, their love for him tangled with a growing sense of dread. They were adrift, cut off from the rational, sunlit world they had always known. The local physician, the man of science and reason, had failed them. He had looked into their son's perfect eyes and seen only an enigma. The world of medicine had closed its doors, leaving the family alone in the growing dark, with a mystery that was only just beginning to unfold. The whispers of their neighbors, once easily dismissed as ignorant gossip, would soon begin to feel like the only explanation left. The transition from the doctor's office to the hushed speculation of the village had begun, a journey from the known world into the realm of curses and unseen things, a place where the light did not illuminate, but instead concealed terrors that only a boy like Jonas could perceive. The failure of science to provide a name for Jonas Brandt's condition left a vacuum, and it is the nature of a small, tightly knit community to abhor a vacuum. Into that void rushed whispers, old fears, and the ancient, resilient language of superstition. The Brandt farmhouse, once a simple dwelling like any other, became a place of morbid curiosity, its perpetually drawn curtains a clear signal of something wrong, something hidden. The world outside the house, the world of neighbors and church socials, began to construct its own narrative to explain the boy who shunned the sun, a narrative woven from threads of fear and suspicion. The problem, they concluded, was not in the boy's eyes, but in his soul. The family's isolation was no longer a choice but a quarantine, imposed by a community that had begun to fear what it could not understand. Life inside the house settled into a suffocating rhythm of twilight. Alara and Silas moved through their darkened rooms like ghosts in their own home, their voices perpetually low, their movements cautious, as if a loud noise or a sudden action might shatter the fragile peace they had managed to create. Jonas himself seemed to have found a strange equilibrium in the gloom. He continued his carving, his small hands moving with a placid certainty, but his quietness had changed. It was no longer the simple reticence of a shy child. It was the stillness of a listener, of someone attending to a conversation no one else could hear. It was during this period that the second, more terrifying phase of his affliction began to manifest. He started to speak of things that were not there. It began subtly. One afternoon, as Alara was mending a tear in one of Silas's work shirts by the weak light of a single window, Jonas looked up from his work and spoke in a clear, untroubled voice. He told her there was a man standing in the far corner of the room, near the hearth. Alara's needle froze mid-stitch, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She forced herself to look, to see only the familiar stones of the fireplace and the deep, empty shadows that clung to them. She told her son there was no one there, that the dim light was playing tricks on his eyes. Jonas considered this for a moment, his head tilted. He then replied, with the same unnerving calm, that the man was not made of light or shadow. He said he was made of something else, something like bent air, and that he was very tall and thin. He said the man was simply watching them. Alara did not know how to respond. A denial felt useless, an affirmation, insane. She said nothing, and the silence in the room grew heavy and thick with a new kind of fear. This was not an isolated incident. Jonas began to describe the shapes he saw with increasing frequency. They were not, he explained, people as he knew them. They were figures, outlines, presences that drifted through their small home as if its walls were no more substantial than mist. He spoke of a shape that crouched on the ceiling above his bed at night, a thing of tangled lines and too many joints. He described small, quick things that skittered at the edges of his vision, disappearing if he tried to look at them directly. To his parents, this was a descent into madness, a new and terrifying symptom of the sickness in his mind. Silas, in a fit of desperate frustration, would light every lamp in the house, flooding the rooms with a brilliant, aggressive light, demanding to know if the boy could still see his phantoms. Jonas would only curl into himself, his hands over his eyes, and whimper that the light did not make them go away. He claimed it only made them clearer, that their edges grew sharp and their forms more complex, and that it was more than he could bear to see. The light, the very thing that represented safety and reason to Silas and Alara, was for their son a tool of revelation, a lens that brought a horrific, invisible world into focus. The family's strange, self-imposed confinement did not go unnoticed. News of Dr. Alistair's failure had spread through the town, confirming in the minds of many that the boy's ailment was not of the natural world. Prudence, a woman whose farm bordered the Brandt's land to the east, took it upon herself to investigate. She arrived one morning under the pretense of borrowing a cup of flour, her eyes scanning the dim interior of the house, noting the shuttered windows and the smell of stale, unmoving air. As Alara measured the flour, Prudence could hear Jonas's soft voice from the other room. He was talking to himself, or so she thought, until she heard him tell his mother that the crooked lady was by the door now, and that she was interested in the visitor's blue shawl. Prudence felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She took her flour and left quickly, her mind racing. She did not see a sick child. She saw a boy in communion with the unseen. Her story became the spark that lit the fire of village gossip. The tale was retold at the general store, over fences, and in the pews before Sunday service. Each telling added a new layer of sinister detail. The boy did not just see things, he spoke with them. He was not just sensitive to light, he was a creature of the dark. The word cursed was soon spoken, at first in hushed tones, then with a grim certainty. The Brandts were no longer just a troubled family. They were a source of potential contagion, a household tainted by something unholy. Old stories were resurrected, tales of changelings and children born with the evil eye. The community, bound by a shared, simple faith and a deep-seated fear of the unknown, began to pull away. Silas found that other farmers would end their conversations abruptly when he approached. Alara felt the stares of the other women in town, a mixture of pity and revulsion. They were isolated, adrift on a sea of fear, and there was only one port left for them to seek. It was Alara who made the decision. Her pragmatism worn down by weeks of terror, she turned to the only other authority she knew, the church. Silas resisted, for he was a man who put his faith in the soil and the seasons, not in prayer and ritual. But he saw the desperation in his wife's eyes, the way she started at every creak of the floorboards, the way she watched Jonas as if he were a stranger. He consented, his agreement a quiet admission of his own profound helplessness. And so, Reverend Michael was summoned to the Brandt farm. He was a young man, earnest and devout, his faith a solid and uncomplicated thing. He had dealt with grief, with doubt, and with sin, but he had never been asked to confront the impossible. He arrived on a gray, overcast afternoon, the muted light a small mercy for the boy he had come to see. He carried a small black bag containing a Bible, a vial of holy water, and a wooden crucifix. The atmosphere inside the house was oppressive. The air was thick and still, the silence broken only by the low ticking of the mantel clock. The Reverend was led into the main room, where Jonas sat on the floor, a half-finished wooden bird in his hands. Reverend Michael was struck by the boy's pallor, the unnatural whiteness of his skin against the gloom. He began gently, his voice soft and kind, asking Jonas about the things he saw. Jonas answered with a disconcerting frankness. He told the Reverend that the shapes were in the room with them now. He pointed with his carving knife toward the ceiling. He said there was a large, slow-moving one up there, like a cloud of smoke with a single, dark spot at its center. He then pointed to a space just behind the Reverend's left shoulder, explaining that a smaller, faster one was there, a thing that looked like a shard of broken glass turning over and over on itself. Reverend Michael felt the hairs on his arms stand up. The boy's descriptions were not the fevered ramblings of a lunatic. They were delivered with a calm, observational detachment that was more chilling than any hysterical fit could have been. The Reverend opened his Bible, its pages a stark white against the shadows. He began to read, his voice filling the room with the ancient, comforting cadences of the Psalms. He spoke of the Lord as a shepherd, of green pastures and still waters, of walking through the valley of the shadow of death and fearing no evil. Jonas listened politely, his head cocked to one side. When the Reverend had finished, the boy said the words were nice, but that the shapes did not seem to hear them. He added that the smoky one on the ceiling had drifted lower while the Reverend was speaking, as if curious about the sound of his voice. Undeterred, Reverend Michael proceeded with the blessing of the house. He walked from room to room, sprinkling holy water on the thresholds of the doors and the sills of the windows, his voice a low, steady murmur of Latin prayers. He was performing a ritual of purification, of demarcation, drawing a holy line between the world of the seen and the world of the unseen, between the sanctuary of the home and the wilderness of the unknown. When he was finished, he returned to the main room. He made the sign of the cross in the air and declared the house to be a fortress of God, protected from all malevolent influence. It was then that Jonas looked at his mother and whispered that the blessing had not made the shapes leave. He said it had only made them angry. He claimed the shard of glass behind the Reverend was now spinning much faster, and that it was making a very high, thin sound, like a knife being sharpened. The young priest's faith, for the first time in his life, was shaken. He had come expecting to find either a troubled mind or a clear case of demonic influence. He found neither. The boy showed no revulsion toward the crucifix, no reaction to the holy water, no fear of the sacred names he invoked. He was not a participant in the spiritual battle. He was merely an observer, a witness to a reality the Reverend could not perceive. The rites had failed. The blessings were empty gestures. The line he had drawn had been ignored. He looked at Silas and Alara, at the desperate hope in their faces, and he had nothing to offer them. He told them he did not believe the boy was possessed, for a demon would have recoiled from the presence of the holy. He suggested, his voice heavy with defeat, that Jonas was afflicted with a vision that was not demonic, but simply other. He said that some were born with a veil over their eyes, and some, perhaps, were born with the veil lifted. It was a pronouncement that was meant to sound profound, but it offered no solace. It was merely another way of saying he did not know. Reverend Michael left the Brandt farm as the sun was setting, the sky a bruised purple and gray. He left the family in a darkness far deeper than the one he had found them in. They were now utterly, terrifyingly alone. The pillars of their world, the rational science of medicine and the steadfast certainty of faith, had both crumbled. The doctor had declared the boy's eyes to be perfect. The priest had declared his soul to be his own. Yet, the shapes remained. The whispers of the neighbors now seemed less like cruel gossip and more like a terrible truth. They were a cursed family, living in a cursed house, with a child who saw a world that no one else could see. As the days grew shorter and the first cold winds of autumn began to strip the leaves from the trees, a new and more potent dread began to settle over the farm. Winter was coming, a season of long nights and deep, isolating snows. They would be trapped in the house, just the three of them, and the things that Jonas saw, and they had no one left to call for help. Winter arrived that year not as a gentle blanket, but as a siege. The first snows fell in early November, heavy and wet, and they did not stop. The world beyond the Brandt's farm was erased, buried under a monolithic expanse of white. The silence was the most profound change. It was a heavy, pressing thing, absorbing the familiar sounds of life, the distant lowing of a neighbor's cattle, the rattle of a passing wagon, and replacing them with the whisper of the wind and the soft, percussive ticking of ice against the window panes. This physical isolation was a cruel mirror to the social exile the family already endured. They were an island, a tiny, darkened house in a sea of snow, and the winter had only just begun. The days were short and gray, the light that filtered through the perpetually shuttered windows thin and weak. For Jonas, this was a reprieve. The tyranny of the sun was broken, its brilliant, accusatory glare replaced by a diffused, gentle gloom. But the things he saw did not diminish with the light. The shapes in the house grew bolder in the endless twilight, their movements less furtive. Life within the farmhouse took on the rigid, silent discipline of a sick room. Silas spent his days tending to the animals in the barn, the short journey from the house, a brutal struggle against the wind and the drifts. He worked with a grim, methodical fury, his physical exhaustion a welcome distraction from the suffocating helplessness that awaited him indoors. The barn, with its familiar smells of hay and livestock and its simple, understandable demands, became his sanctuary. Inside the house, Ilara managed a shrinking domestic world. She moved through the dim rooms with a quiet efficiency, her face a mask of weary composure. She and Silas spoke little. Their conversations were clipped and practical, focused on the necessities of survival, the dwindling supply of firewood, the state of the preserved food in the cellar. The one subject they never broached, the one that filled every silence and haunted every shared glance, was their son. They had developed a terrible, unspoken agreement to not ask him what he was seeing, to not acknowledge the bent-air man in the corner or the tangled thing on the ceiling. To speak of them would be to grant them a reality they could not bear to accept. They chose to live with the ghosts, pretending with every fiber of their being that they were alone. Jonas, for his part, seemed to have retreated even further into his own world. He sat for hours by the weak light of a single oil lamp, his small hands never still, the carving knife a permanent extension of his fingers. He was no longer carving the familiar forms of woodland creatures. His creations had become strange, his wooden blocks transformed into objects with unsettling angles and configurations that seemed to defy the natural grain of the pine. They were things of asymmetry, of impossible balance, objects that hurt the eye to look at for too long. He would sometimes stop his work and his gaze would drift to the windows, his pale eyes fixed on the gray, indistinct world beyond the glass. He was watching for something, waiting. His parents saw this, and a new, cold fear began to take root in their hearts. The enemy was no longer just within the walls of their home. Their son's attention was being drawn to the vast, empty wilderness outside. The night it happened was deep in the heart of December. A blizzard had descended upon them, a howling maelstrom of wind and snow that had raged for 2 days without pause. The house groaned under the assault, the timbers creaking like the bones of some great dying animal. The wind shrieked in the chimney, a sound like a tortured voice that seemed to be trying to find a way inside. They had finished their meager supper of bread and salted pork in silence, the flickering lamplight casting their faces in a dramatic, unsettling dance of light and shadow. Silas was staring into the fire, his mind a numb blank. Ilara was knitting, the rhythmic click of her needles a small, defiant sound against the fury of the storm. Jonas was on the floor, arranging his strange wooden carvings into a complex, spiraling pattern. The scene was one of domestic tranquility, a fragile illusion held together by sheer force of will. The illusion shattered without a sound. Jonas suddenly went still. His hands, which had been moving with such fluid purpose, froze in midair. The wooden object he was holding fell from his fingers and clattered softly on the floorboards. Neither Silas nor Ilara noticed at first, so lost were they in their own thoughts. But the silence from Jonas's corner of the room was a different kind of silence. It was not the quiet of concentration, but the absolute stillness of terror. Ilara looked up, her needles ceasing their clicking. She saw her son's face. It was chalk white, his mouth a thin, bloodless line. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the front door. He was not looking at the door, but through it, as if the solid wood were no more than a sheet of glass. A low sound escaped his throat, a soft, guttural whimper. Silas turned, his stupor broken by the raw fear in his wife's expression. He asked Jonas what was wrong, what he was seeing. For a long moment, the boy did not seem to hear him. He was completely captivated by whatever he perceived beyond the door. Then, his head turned slowly, his eyes locking with his father's. His voice, when it came, was a reedy, trembling whisper. He said something was coming. He said it had been walking through the snow for a long time, and now it was close. He said it was big. Silas felt a surge of anger, a desperate, irrational fury at this new intrusion of his son's madness. He told the boy it was just the wind, that the storm was playing tricks on him. He rose to his feet, intending to comfort his son, to shake him from his trance. But before he could take a step, Jonas let out a sharp, piercing cry. He scrambled backward, away from the door, his hands flying up to cover his eyes. He began to sob, his small body convulsing. He cried that it was outside the house now. He said it was standing in the yard. A primal fear, cold and sharp, cut through Silas's anger. Alara rushed to Jonas's side, trying to hold him, to soothe him, but he was inconsolable. He thrashed in her arms, screaming that they had to put out the light, that it must not see them. His terror was a palpable thing, a force that filled the small room and seemed to suck the very air from their lungs. Driven by an instinct he did not understand, Silas grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and went to the nearest window. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. His breath misted on the cold glass. He scraped away a small patch of the thick, crystalline frost with his fingernail and peered out into the maelstrom. He saw exactly what he expected to see. Nothing. There was only the blizzard, a chaotic, blinding vortex of white. The snow was a shapeless, churning fury, the world outside reduced to an utter negation of form and substance. There were no shapes, no figures, no tracks. There was only the storm and the night. He turned back to the room, ready to tell his son that he was wrong, that there was nothing there. But the words died in his throat. Jonas was no longer simply crying. He had collapsed to the floor, his body seized by a violent fit. His back arched, his limbs rigid, his eyes rolled back in his head. His shrieks were no longer coherent words, but raw, animal sounds of pure, unadulterated horror. He was not reacting to a fear in his mind. He was reacting to a stimulus, to something he was perceiving with an intensity that was destroying him. Alara, her face streaked with tears, held him, whispering his name over and over, a desperate litany against the terror. Jonas's screams suddenly coalesced back into words that were more terrifying than the silence had been. He cried that it was vast. He said it had no face, no eyes, but it was looking at them. He screamed that it was bright, that the snow was not white enough to hide it, that its brilliance was pushing against the walls of the house. Blinded by brilliance, the phrase hung in the air, a piece of impossible poetry amidst the chaos. Silas found himself moving toward the front door, his hand outstretched toward the iron bolt. He did not know what he intended to do. Open it, prove to his son, to himself, that there was nothing there but the wind and the snow. Some part of him, a cold, rational part, knew this was insanity, but another, deeper part, needed to see the emptiness for himself. He needed to feel the clean, cold wind on his face and know that the monster was only in his son's mind. He drew the heavy bolt, the sound a loud, jarring crack in the cacophony of the storm. He pulled the door inward just a few inches, creating a narrow slit through which he could see the front yard. The wind howled through the opening, blasting him with a spray of fine, icy snow. He pressed his eye to the crack and looked. He saw the familiar shape of the well cover, already a soft mound under the snow. He saw the skeletal branches of the old oak tree, thrashing wildly in the wind. He saw the endless, shifting curtain of the blizzard. He saw an empty, desolate world, a world devoid of any presence, vast or otherwise. He slammed the door shut and bolted it, his body trembling with a mixture of relief and a new, more profound dread. He had seen nothing. But his son was still on the floor, his fit subsiding into a series of shuddering, exhausted sobs. He was no longer screaming, but whispering, his voice a hoarse, broken thing. He whispered that it was still there. He said it was waiting. He said it was curious about the light inside their house. Alara cradled the boy's head in her lap, rocking him gently, her own fear a cold stone in her stomach. The unseen presence, the vast and brilliant something that stood just beyond their walls, was now a third occupant in the room. Its reality was confirmed not by sight, but by the utter devastation of their son's senses. The question of whether it was real or imagined had become irrelevant. For Jonas, it was real, and his perception had become their prison. The family was trapped, huddled together in the lamplight, besieged by a storm from without and a horror from within, a horror made all the more absolute because only one of them had the eyes to see it. The long winter night stretched before them, an abyss of time to be endured in the company of an intruder that was both invisible and overwhelming. The violent seizure left Jonas a changed boy. The terror of that night, the night of the winter apparition, did not recede with the storm. The blizzard eventually exhausted itself, leaving behind a world of profound and unnerving stillness, a landscape sculpted by a brutal, alien hand into mountains of snow and valleys of shadow. But the storm that had broken inside Jonas did not pass. It had scoured him out, leaving behind not a void, but a terrible, driving clarity. The fit had been a threshold, and in crossing it, he had shed the last vestiges of his fear, replacing it with a quiet, feverish obsession. He was no longer a passive, terrified witness to the things he saw. He had become their cartographer. The unseen world that had pressed against the walls of their home had found a breach, and now it was pouring into him, demanding to be given form. It began with a single piece of charcoal, salvaged from the cooled ashes of the hearth. One morning, a few days after the blizzard, Alara found him not with his wooden blocks, but on his hands and knees on the rough floorboards of the main room. He was drawing. It was not the simple, childish scrawl she might have expected. He worked with a strange, raptorial intensity, his small hand moving with a speed and precision that was unnerving. He was not sketching an object or a scene. He was tracing a line, a single, unbroken line that looped and coiled upon itself, creating a pattern of such bewildering complexity that it seemed to vibrate on the wood. It was a knot of infinite intricacy, a shape that seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence. Alara called to Silas, her voice a hushed whisper of alarm. He came in from the barn, stamping the snow from his boots, his face etched with a permanent, weary frown. He stood over his son, watching the black line grow, a cancerous bloom on the floor of their home. He asked Jonas what he was doing. The boy did not look up. He replied, his voice flat and distant, that he was drawing the path the small, sharp one took when it moved through the room. This was the beginning. The single drawing on the floor was a seed of a vast and terrible forest. When he ran out of space on the floorboards, Jonas moved to the walls. He did not ask for permission. The act was not one of defiance, but of necessity, as involuntary as breathing. He began to cover the pale, whitewashed plaster with his charcoal visions. The house, their small sanctuary against the winter, began its transformation into a gallery of impossibilities. Silas, at first, tried to stop him. He took the charcoal from the boy's hand and told him to cease the foolishness. Jonas did not cry or argue. He simply stood, his expression one of profound, sorrowful patience, as if waiting for his father to understand the futility of his command. Later that night, Silas found him in the dark, using a burnt stick from the woodpile to continue his work. The scratching sound, a dry, insect-like whisper in the silence. After that, Silas did not try to stop him again. There was a sense that interfering was not just pointless, but dangerous, like trying to dam a river that had already broken its banks. The drawings were not of monsters. They were, in some ways, far more terrifying. They were diagrams of an alien physics, blueprints of a hostile creation. He drew landscapes that defied all known principles of perspective. In one, a river flowed uphill toward a horizon that was fractured into multiple, competing vanishing points. Trees grew downward from a sky that was filled not with clouds, but with crystalline lattices that interlocked like the gears of a vast, unknowable machine. He drew structures that were architectural nightmares, buildings with staircases that led back to their own starting point, with windows that looked out onto the interior of the very room they were in. The geometries he depicted were a form of visual poison. To look at them for too long was to feel a sense of profound cognitive dissonance, a feeling that the solid, dependable rules of the world up and down, near and far, inside and outside were a fragile consensus that Jonas's art had contemptuously shattered. Ilara found she could no longer bear to be in the main room. The walls seemed to writhe with the black lines, the patterns shifting and rearranging themselves at the edge of her vision. She felt that the drawings were not inert markings, but living things, dormant eyes that watched her every move. She retreated to the kitchen, the one room Jonas had not yet claimed, but even there she was not safe. The boy began to use any surface he could find. He unearthed old newspapers from a storage chest and covered the printed words with his frantic, spidery script of shapes. He found a stack of his mother's sewing patterns on thin, brittle paper and filled their margins with his impossible topographies. The house was shrinking, the space for normal life compressed by the relentless expansion of his visionary world. The air grew thick with the smell of charcoal and soot, and the family's existence became a cramped, claustrophobic affair, lived out in the ever-decreasing spaces between the maps of a world they could not see. When they asked him what these places were, his answers were always the same, delivered with the serene, unshakable confidence of a seasoned traveler. He told them he walked there. He explained, in his simple, direct way, that when his body slept in its bed, he was awake somewhere else. He said these were the places he went. He described walking through forests of bone-white trees under the light of a black, pulsating Sunday. He spoke of cities built from a substance that was like solid smoke, inhabited by tall, silent figures whose forms he could never quite resolve. He insisted that these were not dreams. He said dreams were foggy and strange, like a poorly remembered story. These places, he swore, were solid. They were real. He could feel the ground under his feet and the air on his skin. The drawings, he explained, were not from his imagination. They were his memories. He was simply recording the places he had been. This confession was, for Silas, the final breaking point of his reason. A sick mind was one thing. A child who claimed his soul was being taken on nightly journeys to alien worlds was another entirely. It was a horror that bordered on the theological, and it spurred him to one last, desperate attempt to find an anchor in the rational world. He chose one of the smaller drawings, a particularly unsettling depiction of a spiral of what looked like thorns and shards of glass, rendered on a piece of brown wrapping paper. He bundled himself against the cold and made the long, arduous journey on foot to the town, the snow-covered landscape, a stark, clean contrast to the Yogadad, complex thing he carried hidden in his coat. He did not go to the doctor, nor to the reverend. He went instead to Mr. Hemlock, the town's schoolmaster, a man known for his collection of books and his interest in the natural sciences and mathematics. Mr. Hemlock was a precise, methodical man, his life ordered by the elegant certainties of algebra and the clear classifications of botany. He greeted Silas with a reserved curiosity, ushering him into a study that smelled of old paper and wood smoke. Silas, his voice rough and hesitant, explained that his son had developed a peculiar talent for drawing, and that he was hoping the schoolmaster might be able to shed some light on the strange patterns he was creating. He unrolled the brittle paper on the schoolmaster's desk. Mr. Hemlock adjusted his spectacles and leaned in for a closer look. A long silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the grate. The schoolmaster's expression shifted from academic curiosity to a deep, furrowed confusion. He traced the lines of the drawing with his finger, his lips pursed. He murmured to himself about the principles of the golden ratio, of fractal patterns in snowflakes and ferns, trying to find a familiar landmark in the hostile territory of the drawing. Finally, he pushed himself back from the desk, a look of profound unease on his face. He confessed to Silas that he had never seen anything like it. He said the pattern was clearly not random. It possessed a definite and rigorous internal logic, yet it was a logic that was utterly alien to him. He explained that the drawing seemed to display a recursive symmetry, but one that appeared to operate in more dimensions than the paper could hold. He told Silas that it was as if a complex, three-dimensional object had been crudely flattened, its true form hinted at but ultimately incomprehensible. He concluded, his voice heavy with a reluctance to admit defeat, that the drawing was either the work of a genius the likes of which the world had never seen, or the product of a mind that was fundamentally and irrevocably broken. He could offer no other explanation. The drawing was not a map of any known place, nor was it a representation of any known mathematical concept. It was, he said, a message from nowhere. Silas walked home through the deepening twilight, the schoolmaster's words a death knell to his hopes. A message from nowhere. The phrase echoed the doctor's assessment of a brilliance only Jonas could see, and the Reverend's theory of a veil that had been lifted. All the men of knowledge had circled the mystery of his son and returned with only metaphors, with admissions of their own blindness. He returned to a house that felt less like a home than a tomb, its walls inscribed with the hieroglyphs of an unspeakable reality. The last tether to the world of reason had been cut. They were alone with it now, just the three of them, the caretakers of a boy who was no longer truly their son, but a living bridge to some other place. As the winter dragged on, Jonas's work grew more frantic. The charcoal-stained walls of his small bedroom were now so thoroughly covered in his black-lined geometries that the original plaster was almost completely obscured. He had created a world within their world, and he was spending more and more of his time there. He would stand for hours before a particular wall, his eyes tracing the intricate pathways, his lips moving in a silent, one-sided conversation. The transition was nearing its completion. The act of documentation was no longer sufficient. The visions were pressing in, straining against the thin membrane of paper and plaster, preparing to move from the walls and into the room itself. The final, sleepless night was approaching, a night when the maps would become the territory. The obsessive, feverish energy that had driven Jonas to cover the walls of his home in impossible geometries began to wane as the winter reached its apex. The frantic, scratching sound of charcoal on plaster, which had become the constant, unsettling soundtrack to their lives, ceased. A new and far more terrifying phase had begun. The silence that fell upon the house was not one of peace, but of anticipation. The dead calm that precedes the final, devastating onslaught of a storm. Jonas no longer needed to draw the things he saw. He had mapped the alien territory so completely that the boundaries between his inner world and the shared space of the farmhouse had started to dissolve. He had brought the elsewhere home, and now it was beginning to take up residence. He abandoned his drawings, leaving the charcoal sticks to lie where they fell amongst the wood shavings and scraps of paper. He began, instead, to simply sit in the center of the main room, his small body rigid, his eyes wide and fixed. He was no longer looking at the walls, but at the empty spaces between them. He would track the progress of some unseen thing with a slow, deliberate turn of his head. His breathing was shallow, his hands clenched into tight fists in his lap. The fear had returned, but it was a different kind of fear now. It was not the panicked, shrieking terror of the winter apparition, but a low, simmering dread, the constant, grinding anxiety of a soldier in a trench, waiting for an attack he knows is inevitable. He was a prisoner under siege, and the enemy was no longer outside the gates, but had breached the final defenses and was now moving freely through the rooms. Alara and Silas could only watch, their helplessness a physical ache, a constant weight in their chests. The quiet boy who carved animals had vanished completely, replaced by this silent, haunted sentinel. They would speak to him, their voices loud and desperate in the stillness, and he would not respond. He was tuned to a different frequency, his senses occupied by a reality that was superimposed over their own. The air in the house grew thick and heavy, charged with a static dread. They began to feel it themselves, a persistent, unnerving sense of being watched, a cold spot that would drift through the room, a flicker of movement at the very edge of their vision, a floorboard that would creak upstairs in the empty loft. They could not see the shapes that Jonas saw, but they could feel their pressure, the way their unseen presence displaced the very air around them. Their son's perception had become a contagion, and the house itself was succumbing to the fever. The final night began with Jonas's refusal to sleep. As Alara tried to lead him to his small bed in the corner room, whose walls were now a solid tapestry of black lines, he resisted. He pulled away from her, his small body trembling violently. His voice, when he spoke, was a ragged, terrified whisper. He told her he could not sleep. He said that if he slept, they would take him. He did not say who they were, but he pointed a trembling finger toward the walls, toward the impossible landscapes he had so meticulously rendered. He said the drawings were not just pictures anymore. He claimed they were doorways, and that they were opening. He said the shapes were coming through. His parents tried to reason with him, to soothe him with empty platitudes about nightmares and overactive imaginations, but their words were hollow, a flimsy shield against the sheer, unshakable conviction of his terror. He refused to be left alone. He insisted on staying in the main room, by the dying embers of the fire, where the three of them could remain together. They acquiesced, too weary and too frightened to argue. They huddled together in the semi-darkness, the only light coming from the faint, orange glow of the hearth. Silas sat in his chair, a heavy shotgun lying across his lap, a useless totem against an enemy he could not see or shoot. Alara sat on the floor, holding Jonas, who was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, though he continued to tremble as if from a profound, internal cold. The hours passed with an agonizing slowness. Every gust of wind against the house, every skittering sound of ice on the roof, was magnified into a threat. The silence was a taut membrane, stretched to the breaking point. Jonas remained awake, his eyes wide and unnaturally bright in the dim light. He had stopped speaking, but his terror was a constant, silent broadcast. He would flinch at nothing, his gaze darting from one empty corner to another. He seemed to be witnessing a terrible, silent drama unfolding around them. He was a spectator at an invasion, and his small, trembling body was the only evidence that it was happening at all. Sometime after midnight, the boy began to whisper again. It was a continuous, frantic monologue, directed at his mother, but intended for the occupants of the room that only he could see. He told her the tall, thin one made of bent air was standing by the window now, and that it was looking out at the snow. He said the one made of tangled lines had come down from the ceiling and was moving across the floor, that its joints clicked without making a sound. He described a new shape, one he had never spoken of before, a thing that was low to the ground and seemed to wet the floorboards as it passed, leaving a dark, shimmering trail that vanished as quickly as it appeared. His descriptions were a horrifying travelogue of their own home, transforming the familiar space into a landscape of alien occupation. Elara felt the last vestiges of her sanity begin to fray. She could not see these things, yet she could almost feel them, their proximity described with such terrifying certainty by her own son. The room felt crowded, the air suffocating. She looked at Silas, a desperate, silent plea in her eyes. She wanted him to do something, to say something, to break the spell of her son's horrifying vision. But her husband was a statue of defeated masculinity, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers, his knuckles white where he gripped the useless shotgun. There was no help to be found there. There was no help to be found anywhere. They were alone in the dark with their son's open eyes. Jonas's whispers grew more desperate. He claimed the shapes were closing in. He said they were curious about him, about the warmth of his body, about the frantic, frightened beating of his heart. He began to cry, his tears silent tracks on his pale cheeks. He begged them to do something, to make the shapes go away. He said their closeness was a pressure, a physical weight that was crushing him. He swore he could not close his eyes, that some external force was holding them open, forcing him to witness this silent, inexorable approach. He was trapped in a state of endless sight, a prisoner in the panopticon of his own perception. The core question that had haunted them for months, could they trust their own senses, or had Jonas's sight revealed what was always there, had reached its terrifying climax? To believe their own eyes was to believe their son was mad. To believe their son was to accept that they were adrift in a sea of invisible monsters. Both possibilities were a kind of damnation. The family was caught in a paradox of perception, a nightmare from which there was no waking. The final, desperate act of the night was born from this impossible choice. Elara, driven by a primal, maternal instinct to comfort her suffering child, to bring light to his terrible darkness, made a decision. She would dispel the shadows. She would prove to him, and to herself, that the room was empty. She would use the honest, simple power of the lamp to banish the phantoms of the night. It was an act of love, of desperation, of a profound and tragic misunderstanding of the nature of her son's curse. The light, she believed, would be his salvation. The transition from a fear of darkness to a final, climactic terror of the light was about to be made. The lamp that was meant to bring comfort would instead become the trigger, the final catalyst that would shatter their world completely. The decision, once made, was executed with a desperate, trembling haste. Elara rose from the floor, her movements stiff and clumsy in the cold, her shadow leaping up the wall behind her like a startled giant. She moved toward the small table where the oil lamp sat, a squat, brass object of reassuring solidity. It was their a true and dependable weapon against the night. She fumbled for the matches, her fingers numb and uncooperative. Silas watched her, his expression a mixture of fear and a faint, flickering hope. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the answer was that simple. Perhaps a flood of honest light would be enough to wash away the phantoms and restore the world to its proper, solid dimensions. The thought was a drowning man's desperate lunge for a piece of floating wreckage. He did not try to stop her. He did not speak a word. He simply watched, his grip on the cold steel of the shotgun the only thing that kept him tethered to the moment. Jonas seemed to sense the shift in the room, the change in his mother's intent. His frantic, whispered monologue ceased. He grew very still, his small body tensing in her arms. He looked at her, his eyes wide, reflecting the dying orange glow of the embers. A new kind of terror entered his expression, a look of profound, pleading denial. He seemed to understand what she was about to do, and the knowledge was more horrifying to him than the silent, creeping approach of the shapes in the dark. He opened his mouth to speak, to warn her, but the only sound that escaped was a dry, choked sob. It was too late. The match scraped against the box, a harsh, violent sound in the charged silence. The small flame bloomed, a tiny, defiant sun in the palm of Alara's hand. She lifted the glass chimney of the lamp and touched the flame to the wick. The light caught, sputtered for a moment, and then swelled into a steady, golden radiance. It was a warm, clean light, a light that should have been a comfort, a blessing. It pushed back the oppressive shadows, chasing them into the corners of the room. It illuminated the familiar, mundane details of their home, the worn patches on the rug, the simple, sturdy furniture, the cracks in the plaster of the walls, and it illuminated the drawings. The charcoal lines, which had been muted and indistinct in the firelight, now sprang into sharp, brutal relief. They were no longer just patterns. They were wounds, black gashes cut into the very skin of the house. The light gave them a depth and a vibrancy they had not possessed before, making them seem to vibrate with a latent, malevolent energy. But it was not the drawings that caused Jonas to scream. It was the light itself. The moment the lamplight touched him, he recoiled as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He threw himself backward, out of his mother's arms, scrambling away from the table, from the source of the illumination. He let out a single, piercing shriek, a sound of such pure, unadulterated agony that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. It was not a scream of fear, but of an agony so profound, so absolute, that it transcended all other emotions. He clawed at his face, his small fingers digging into the flesh around his eyes as if trying to tear them from their sockets. He screamed that the light revealed too much. He cried that it was unbearable, that he could see them now, truly see them, and that their forms were a truth the mind could not hold. His parents were frozen, paralyzed by the sheer, explosive violence of his reaction. The light that was meant to save him was destroying him. In the brilliant, steady glow of the lamp, they saw their son writhe on the floor, his body contorting not in a seizure, but in a desperate, impossible struggle against his own senses. He was trying to escape his own sight. He swore the light was not empty. He shrieked that it was full, that it was a medium, a substance through which the true shapes of things could be seen. He cried that the figures were not made of shadow or bent air, but of light itself, of a complex, interwoven brilliance that was hidden within the mundane glow of the lamp. He claimed the man by the window was a towering figure of fractured, geometric light. He claimed the tangled thing on the floor was a vortex of searing, white-hot lines. He was not seeing phantoms in the dark. He was seeing the horrific, intricate anatomy of the light, and it was a sight that was burning him from the inside out. His eyes, which he had fought so desperately to close, were now wide open, locked in a state of horrific, unwavering perception. They were no longer the pale, gentle eyes of a child, but two shining, terrified orbs that seemed to reflect a brilliance that was not in the room. He was staring, unblinking, into the heart of the lamp's glow, but he was not seeing the flame. He was seeing through it, beyond it, into the terrible, layered reality it illuminated. His final words were a choked, broken whisper. He said that the shapes were inside the light, that they had always been inside the light, and that he could not bear to see them anymore. He begged them to make it stop. He swore he would not, could not, close his eyes ever again. He was trapped, his vision a curse, from which there was no respite, no deliverance of a closing eyelid. What happened next was a blur of confusion and terror for Silas and Alara, a moment that would replay in their minds for the rest of their lives, always indistinct, always shrouded in the smoke of trauma and disbelief. Jonas, in a final, convulsive burst of energy, scrambled to his feet. He moved with a speed and agility they had never seen in him, a frantic, desperate flight. He was not running from them. He was running from the light. He fled from the main room, away from the damning glow of the lamp, and into the unlit, pitch-black corridor that led to the back of the house. They heard the sound of the rear door, the one that led to the frozen fields, being thrown open. They heard a single, final cry, a sound that was not of pain or fear, but of a strange, chilling relief. And then, silence. A profound, absolute silence, broken only by the steady, indifferent hum of the lamp on the table and the howling of the wind outside. They found the back door wide open, swinging gently in the wind, a black rectangle gaping against the swirling snow of the night. Of Jonas, there was no sign. Silas took the lamp and ran out into the yard, his bare feet sinking into the deep, icy powder. He screamed his son's name until his throat was raw, the sound swallowed by the vast, white emptiness. There were no tracks. The snow was a pristine, unbroken blanket, the blizzard's endless motion having already erased any trace of the boy's passage. It was as if he had stepped through the doorway and had simply ceased to be, dissolved into the storm and the darkness. They searched until the dawn, a frantic, hopeless quest through the frozen landscape. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a scrap of cloth, not a single sign that he had ever been there. Jonas Brandt was gone. He was never seen again. The official explanation, the one recorded by the town constable, was that the boy, in a state of fever-induced delirium, had wandered out into the blizzard and perished. His body lost to the snow until the spring thaw, but his body was never found. Not in the spring, when the snows melted to reveal the bruised and sodden earth, and not in any spring that followed. He had vanished from the world as completely as one of his own phantoms. The house on the Brandt farm was abandoned a few years later, Silas and Alara having been broken by the silence and the memory of that final, terrible night. The charcoal drawings remained on the walls, fading and flaking over the decades, a cryptic, forgotten testament to the boy who saw too much. The story of Jonas Brandt became a local legend, a ghost story told to frightened children, the details blurring and shifting with each retelling. But at its heart remained the chilling, unanswered question: what did he see in the light that was so terrible it drove him out into a killing storm? Was it a madness that finally consumed him, or was it a truth, a glimpse into a reality so vast and so brilliant that the human mind was never meant to witness it? The only certainty is that his eyes, which the doctor had declared to be perfect, had shown him a world that science could not explain and religion could not sanctify. And in the end, it was not the darkness that took him, but the light. The case file on Jonas Brandt is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.